This is Law Bites, a podcast with Michael Geist.
We begin with Meta's decision to end news access for Canadians on Facebook and Instagram. The company announced today it's officially starting that process, which will take a few weeks. That's in response to the passing of the Online News Act. That new law requires tech giants to pay news outlets for their content shared on their platforms.
Welcome back to the Law Bites podcast. After a brief break in the month of August, the podcast is back, and with it, talk about the Online News Act, or Bill C-18. Now, I promise there will be other topics in the weeks ahead, but the dominant digital policy issue in Canada over the past 6 weeks has unquestionably been the response to the law, notably including Meta's blocking of news links in Canada and the release of draft regulations that could lead Google to follow suit. While supporters of Bill C-18 were convinced that Meta was bluffing when it insisted that it would block news links in response to a law that effectively mandates payments for them, it has become clear that it was no bluff. All news, both Canadian and foreign sources, are blocked on Facebook and Instagram, and the report suggests that the move has had no real impact in use of the platforms. Where it has had an impact, however, is on the news outlets themselves, many of whom have experienced significant reductions in referral traffic, which invariably leads to less revenues. Much of the attention is on the big players, but the problem is particularly acute for smaller and independent news outlets. Chris Dinn is the founder and publisher of Torontoverse, a new Toronto news outlet that combines news with mapping technologies to create a new way of engaging with the news. The year-old site was growing quickly, but announced that it was slowing down in response to Bill C-18's impact. Chris joins me on the podcast to talk about the business, the effect of the government legislation, and what he thinks should come next. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you've taken the time to come out. You know, Bill C-18 has had a huge impact, of course, on the Canadian media sector, most notably with Meta blocking news links on Facebook and Instagram. And it seems that just about everyone's waiting to see how Google responds in the coming weeks. Now, a lot of that focus has, of course, been on the impact on some of the so-called like household media names. There's been some focus, of course, on CBC, on Post Media, and some of the other more conventional, larger newspaper type outlets. But I think your story places lesser known media startups in the spotlight. So why don't we start there? I'd love to start with a bit of your background as we record this. I see an Emmy Award, literally the trophy in the background. So I'd love to know the story behind that, but a bit about you and a bit about Torontoverse. You know, what is it? Why did you start it, and what made it different?
Sure. Well, I think I'll start with Torontoverse because I think that's really where all this centers. Torontoverse is a chance or an attempt to reinvent local media coverage. We're trying to place it inside a fabric of open data and on a map, an interactive map, but still publish a lot of the traditional things that local newspapers have always published: news and sports and transit, arts, that sort of thing. And through doing this interactive map, create new opportunities for local companies to market themselves. So new advertising opportunities that are easy to buy and are backed by the same kind of data that Facebook and Meta, Google are able to use to make their ads so attractive to local advertisers. And that brings me to my background. Before starting Torontoverse, I was actually one of the tech leads at Google Ad Manager, which is a very large ad server. I was in New York working with that team for a number of years. My focus was on actually video ads, particularly live video ads. That's where the Emmy comes from. We worked a lot with CBS and AMC and Fox and Disney and a lot of other publications. And at some point, our team was nominated for an Emmy for some of the video stream stitching work that we did. But one of the things I learned working at Ad Manager is that there's a real opportunity here. Local media isn't really able to capture local marketing dollars the way that it used to. And Torontoverse, I think, is really about trying to bring that back, bring back that virtuous cycle.
And it's super interesting. I mean, when you go onto the site to see that kind of mapping, don't pun intended, of the map with news and other information is a way of looking at news and information that we don't see as much. We certainly don't see it from some of the conventional spaces. When did this start up, and what kind of response have you gotten?
So we launched just a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. So we had a really, up until the summer, up until August, we had a really great year. We were growing pretty quickly. We'd seen some challenges. Twitter was very strong for us last fall and is not so strong for us now, but we've been very strong, on Facebook. People responded very well. The site traffic had been growing, month over month in the double digits for, 12 solid months. I'm very happy with that. And more importantly, we're getting the kind of interaction from people we really wanted to see. Part of our site, that map is about indexing news. Local news makes sense to put it on a map. But when users interact with that map, they tell us the parts of the city they care about. Some people really care about Scarborough. Some people really care about Etobicoke. They care about different parts of the GTA. And the map lets users show us that. And in turn, we can use that to help local advertisers save money and target the audiences they want to reach without mining people's history or looking for cookies or behavioral data or anything like that.
And how do you grow something like that from scratch? Is it social media? Is it search? Is it your own advertising? What's the strategy to start generating that kind of growth?
That's a great question. So how do you launch a publication in the modern era? We spent a lot of time experimenting with this. And you can do, you can advertise it a little bit, and that's good. But I think, what we learned through experimentation is that Canadians really consume their news on Facebook, on Twitter, on social media platforms, but particularly Facebook and to a lesser extent, Twitter or X. We would buy ads to promote, like if you have a new story, people have never heard of us. So our job as somebody, the brand new product, is to show it to new people. So occasionally we'd promote a story or buy an ad promoting our website here or there, but overwhelmingly we relied on organic reach on social media platforms to find users. We didn't launch with a budget, the multi-million-dollar marketing budget. We launched with the intention of starting small and building an audience as we built our technology. We were really relying on social media to build our audience.
Okay, so it's interesting. So as you're going about building this, the debate over Bill C-18 is taking place. Were you paying attention to the bill at all? And if not, when did it really begin to hit your radar screen?
So I watched the bill closely. Throughout the time it was being debated. I paid a little bit of attention to the committee discussions and things like that. In general, I would say that it was hard to tell how much of this bill was a negotiating strategy and very, very strong rhetoric meant to sort of bring Facebook and Google to the table to negotiate, and how much of it was serious policymaking. I think I feel foolish admitting this. I assumed that it wasn't serious policymaking for a very long time, and it wasn't until late April that I noticed that the rhetoric had heated up to a point that I felt it was going to be very difficult for Facebook and Meta to accept the terms the government was offering, but also very difficult for the government to back down with the rhetoric that it was using.
And that's certainly where we find ourselves now. You're right that that both have kind of hardened their positions on both sides of this, which it seems makes an out more and more difficult. Obviously, sort of listeners will know, and many Canadians will know that Facebook and Instagram began blocking news traffic as we record this about 6 weeks ago, and it played out over a few weeks, but it's been a complete block now for quite some time, certainly far longer than was the case in Australia. So any thought that this was just going to be Australia all over again, I think has largely gone away. What have been the implications for your site's traffic and for your business as a whole from the news link blocking on those two platforms?
Well, the traffic, for us, unfortunately, we were getting upwards of 50% of our traffic from Facebook on a monthly basis. And so what that means is that traffic, I guess our organic traffic has ticked up a little bit, but the majority of that traffic has been lost. What's worse for us, though, is that it's also closed off our opportunities for growth. If you imagine, we've got a new product. It's not very old, and media products, they evolve a lot in their early years. You really need to show them to people. You need to introduce people to your product. Unfortunately, unlike most other businesses in Canada, we're unable to use the number one marketing tool that Canadian businesses across the country use, and that's Facebook.
Okay, wow. So that's pretty dramatic. What's it meant in practical terms to the business? How have you responded? That if you're saying half or even more than half of your traffic coming from a single source, that feels a bit existential.
Yeah, well, it absolutely is. Absolutely is. And my response, one of the advantages of being small and new is that we can be nimble. From my point of view, the question becomes, okay, I don't want this website to go offline. I don't want to run out of money. And so what I've had to do basically is I've furloughed my staff. We had a developer and an editor who were working full time on the project, as well as myself. I furloughed my staff for the time being, And we are basically, we're still releasing content. We had 2 full-time staffers, but Torontoverse was made by a huge team of freelance contributors from across Canada and across the city. So we will continue to publish content, but it will be at a much slower pace.
Okay, so some real world impact. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that freelancers play a big role in the news development side or the news content side of the site, because the regulations that have come out around C-18 reward, assuming that Google does participate in this, if they're at least in, it rewards those that have full-time journalists employed. And the implications, even for a site like yours, with that investment, is that a lot of that investment might not even be rewarded based on the way that the regulations are set up.
I mean, that's hugely disappointing to me personally, from a policy perspective, because I really see, from a local journalism perspective, independent journalists would say, imagine a strong newsletter following of potentially Substack users or Patreon users who support them. A community that's supported by a lot of journalists with strong independent audiences who can then bring their content to a platform like ours. I mean, that's win-win. We can help them expand their audience, help them find new readers they didn't find before, and they can help us get content that's really good for our platform. And everybody's better off in that environment. I'd love to be able to hire people full time, and I think if we grew we would, but I think it's great to have these independent journalists in the community. So it's sad to see them discouraged by the policy like this.
I think that's true. As we talk, there's still some uncertainty how Google will respond to those regulations. What do you see as the impact if they choose to follow Meta's lead and remove news from Google search?
So one thing I've learned talking to other publishers is that we, being so new and so tech oriented, we were heavily dependent on Facebook in a way that a lot of other publications are more dependent on Google for traffic volume. So I think a lot of publishers are looking at the situation. They're not happy because they've lost, maybe 25 or 30% of their traffic from Meta, but they're probably very scared, a lot more scared about losing all of the traffic from Google as well, which could, bring them also up over 50%. I think it's scary, and it's scary for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. No, when you note just how reliant you are, especially when you're starting from essentially from scratch on social media in particular, that highlights how there is this outsized impact on the innovative side of the ledger when it comes to news media. Now, some of your public comments have, I think, interestingly focused on the investment aspects of that.
Mm-hmm.
The willingness of those to invest in media in Canada in light of some of those challenges. It feels a bit like an underexplored issue. We haven't heard a lot of people talking about the implications of this for investment and innovation in the space. Can you explain or talk a bit about that issue from your perspective?
Yeah, because this is where it's really, we were building, I think, a pretty innovative piece of technology. If we'd been able to build a really successful ad model for local media in Toronto, it's the kind of thing that we could easily replicate in other cities across the country. So for us, we view what we're doing as a growth operation, as a growth business. But investors think about a lot of things when they're trying to fund a business. One of the things to think about is the size of the market. Toronto's a really big market. Canada's a great market. The other thing they might ask is, what's your access to that market? If everybody wants your product, but there's no road to get from, your farm to the market, then it's going to be hard for your business to be successful. And if, there might be a great audience full of readers in Toronto to consume our content, but if we can't access that market, if the traditional ways that people, present new products, new digital products to users aren't available to us, there's less of a chance of us being successful, and there's less of a reason to invest in what we do. But worse than that, there's a lot of uncertainty now that the government has actively intervened, in a strongly negative way in the sort of the media startup ecosystem here in Canada. There's not a lot of faith that even if they were to recognize the problem, that the next steps they take to fix it, would be constructive, right? There's a lack of trust amongst, a lot of investors don't like to invest in the media. It hasn't been a really successful business for quite a while. As you'll see, a lot of the big media companies in Canada are struggling. We're doing something very innovative, I think, that changes that for us. But we do have to fight that uphill battle when we're talking to investors. And unpredictable government intervention that has material impact on your business, that's the kind of thing that really scares investors away.
Okay, so a big impact on the investment side. Given the reduction in traffic, potential for even more reduction in traffic, and the exit of potential investors into the space, where do you foresee others moving in this as this continues to unfold? There's been a lot of emphasis, of course, on some of the large legacy players and the impact that they have felt in the media space for the better part of a decade, but the government oftentimes did not focus much attention on the emergence of many new models, on the emergence of many new players. Do you see in some ways your experience almost being the thin edge of the wedge, where we start to see this play out more and more as we move up to the stack?
Yeah, absolutely. We are going to see this cascade. We're a free ad-supported publication. We need broad reach in our market to be successful. Broad reach is how you build, big audiences that let you, support a strong advertising division. Other publications that might rely more on subscription, a lot of media companies have moved towards subscriptions. Subscriptions are a great business model and they can really support you when things like this happen. But, we're in a tight market. Canadians are seeing their mortgages jump by hundreds of dollars a month. It's a hard market to sell subscriptions in. And the nature of the subscription business is you really need to show your content to a lot of people before they decide to subscribe. YouTube, I'm not sure what their subscription rate is, but I remember, hearing it was somewhere around the 2%, 1.5%, something like that. If you're generous, you say you have to show your content to 50 people, and typically you have to show it to them over and over again. Eventually they say, yeah, I really like this content. I want to subscribe. If publishers can't reach users on Facebook, it's going to be a lot harder for them to keep those subscriptions growing. And as things churn, as expenses change for Canadians out there, it's going to be harder to grow those businesses too. It's just going to take a little longer for them to feel it.
It's a pretty dire situation. It's a really interesting observation about how this extends to the subscription paywalled world as well, which is sometimes the knee-jerk reaction. It's like, well, why don't you just set up a paywall and generate subscription revenue? But this has an impact on that side of the business as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, given that situation, I guess it raises the question, what do you think the government should be doing about Bill C-18? We certainly still see a lot saying that, government needs to stand up to big tech, arguing that, this is a power play. And at the end of the day, you just can't back down, and the consequences are what they are. Where do you stand on what the government ought to be doing, given where it finds itself, given where everyone finds the current situation?
So I think, I absolutely think it's a problem that Google and Facebook have such outsized control on the Canadian media diet, on how Canadians consume information. I think that is a problem. So I want to say that up front. I think it does require policy intervention, but I think that the way that C-18 has gone about solving this problem has been a huge mistake, and the government needs to repeal it, backpedal, and, come up with some sort of support for local media. I was shocked when the block came down and there was not even a communication of, a plan for support for independent media organizations like us. I think they really need to unwind the situation and realize that this is not actually helping the situation at all. And try to get things back to where they were. I'm not sure how easy that will be to do. I don't know how badly things have gone in negotiations with Meta, but I really think they need to step back very quickly and reassess how to achieve these policy goals more effectively.
Yeah, no, it doesn't sound very promising, certainly with Meta, and even the regulations on the Google side didn't really show much signs of backing down. So it does feel like a bit of an escalation. What should the government be doing to support media? Or do you believe they ought to be supporting media? You hinted that you thought there needed to be something in light of the kind of real world impact that we've seen from C-18. What do you see as I guess, if they could wipe the slate clean, what would you be doing? And then alternatively, I suppose, without the slate being clean, with realities of what C-18 has brought, what next steps are available to try to address the issue, other than sort of going back to square one?
So I do think that that there is a problem here, and I think the fact that Meta was able to just drop news coverage in Canada, and not affect its overall business. This is not something that's going to have a huge impact on Meta's bottom line when they, do quarterly results, and it's not going to affect their stock. This is a great example of how it's bad for Canada that these companies have so much power. I think Canadians need access to journalism. I absolutely believe that. I started a media company. I absolutely believe that. But I think the idea that what's wrong is that Canadians need a way to pay for journalism, it's sort of like that's first order thinking. It's missing the heart of the problem. What Canadians are really missing is a local media ecosystem, a case where local marketing dollars are spent to support the creation of local content. This is a virtuous cycle. This is like a big flywheel that, when it's spinning effectively, really helps build strong communities. You think about it, when that money is spent with a local publication, it goes to funding, stories being told, coverage of the community, things that enrich the very community that the advertiser is spending money to support. When they spend money with Facebook or with Google, that's going to pay for somebody's pool in Menlo Park or Mountain View. It's not creating that same feedback cycle that drives these vibrant communities that we all want to live in, right? And that we're all seeing sort of like sucked away from us bit by bit as these media entities disappear. for me, the way that you bring that back, the way that you make journalism or that local media ecosystem thrive is you make it easier for people to start these small businesses. I mean, I guess it's easy for me to say that, but I really think that, if we could make CBC content, video and audio licensable in the same way that Canadian press content is, maybe you pay a small fee, or, we should also subsidize access to the Canadian press and allow people like me or other publications, it could be major publications, to have access to a strong base of, well-reported, reliable journalism content that they can then use to build publications on top of. So they then can augment that with, richer local news or local perspectives and things like that create a compelling local publication and try to recapture that virtuous cycle, that flywheel that Torontoverse was trying to restart.
Yeah. No, I that notion of open content, certainly from CBC, is something that I've talked about for a long time, and we see others raising it as well. Ironically, of course, CBC stands to be perhaps the biggest beneficiary of all of C-18, which seems to move them more and more in the opposite direction, as opposed to one in which content gets shared. It's looking to monetize content by lining up in exactly the same way that the private side of the world does.
It's unfortunate because I think I mentioned Canadian press largely because I think it's a great precedent for what a relationship with the CBC could look like for publications that want to republish their content. You can agree to certain standards, you can make sure that it's credited to the CBC and that it's presented in a certain way. But, these wire services or content sharing services are well established in the media business. And what's great about the CBC is that they produce a lot of content that could help people build multimedia products that really are very difficult to go from 0 to 1 in the modern world.
No, it's an interesting idea. I mean, it does occur to me, I guess, just to close with this, that the prescription that you're raising in some ways is almost the polar opposite of what C-18 has tried to do. Not so much, not with regard to the focus on trying to get Meta and Google to pay up for linking to news, but rather the emphasis quite clearly in C-18 on the legacy providers. It's on sort of the large players that have clearly faced real challenges, to trying to provide them with the support. And what you're saying is it seems to me, we need to turn our attention to the next generation of news players, the next generation of technology, next generation of innovators in this space, and find ways to solve our solutions, not by trying to fix what was wrong necessarily with some of the players that have struggled, but rather to find new players who identify ways of doing it differently.
And if we restart that flywheel, right, if we get that cycle going again, those publications will also benefit. They won't benefit disproportionately, they'll benefit in proportion to the communities that they serve. But I think we'll all see, more local advertising dollars spent supporting local content, which is going to make our communities better. It's going to make all of these media businesses better. It'll be a rising tide that helps everybody.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's it's nice to end on an optimistic note like that. This has been a pretty pessimistic situation for the last number of months, and it's good to know that there is still that kind of optimism and those possibilities. Chris, I know you've been going through a lot. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast and talk a bit about your real world experience about what's been taking place, trying to create a new media company and dealing with the implications and the outcomes from Bill C-18.
I really appreciate the chance to talk to you. Thanks.
That's the Law Bites podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbites@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBitesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bites podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.